Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be going over Chapter 34 of the American Pageant titled America in World War II from 1941 to 1945. As always, we're going to be using the 16th edition of the American Pageant. If you have an earlier or a later edition or a completely different textbook, don't worry about it, the content's going to be the same. So to start off, let's talk about key concepts, or rather lack thereof. Obviously, I don't put in the key concepts in my videos anymore, but if you want to reference them, you can find them at the beginning of every chapter in the American Pageant. Personally, I would highly recommend using the key concepts at least once because it really helps to sort of categorize the information in a way that makes it easier to recall when you're taking a test, specifically the AP exam. So I highly recommend you do that if you want to sort of consolidate the information in a way that is really easy to recall and remember. Okay, so to start off, let's talk about why the US decides to enter World War I. And as we were aware of, last chapter we talked about Pearl Harbor and how that was really sort of the breaking point for when the US decides to get involved, because up until this point they haven't been hugely directly impacted. Obviously it was a bit difficult to navigate international waters, but regardless they hadn't been too significantly directly impacted. But after the Pearl Harbor attacks, the US and Britain signed the ABC-1 agreement, which said that if the US entered the war, they would first focus on defeating Germany. And this agreement was really important given that the US primarily wanted to take revenge against Japan for the Pearl Harbor attacks, but if they focused their resources there first, Hitler could take over Britain and the Soviet Union. So after defeating Germany, the Allied forces agreed that they would attack Japan, but until then, reinforcements were going to be sent in. Meanwhile, many immigrants from Axis power countries like Germany and Italy loyally supported the war efforts, which sped up assimilation, and this contrasted World War I, where the loyalty of immigrants was often questioned. However, both Japanese immigrants and first-generation Japanese Americans fared much poorly compared to immigrants from Axis power countries. For example, under FDR's Executive Order 9066, 110,000 Japanese Americans were placed in concentration camps as the federal government feared that if Japan successfully attacked the mainland, the US, Japanese Americans would become traitors. This led to the Supreme Court case Korematsu v. US in 1944, and essentially the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the concentration camps, but later in 1988, the federal government apologized by paying every camp survivor $20,000 in reparations. Obviously, money isn't really going to solve the trauma that they experienced, but something is better than nothing, I guess. Moving on, let's talk about the federal organizations that are going to be formed and really critical for how the US operates during war. For example, you should know about the War Production Board, also known as the WPB. This oversaw production of war products like weaponry, planes, ships, and cut down on non-essential production, like passenger cars. They also mandated rationing vital supplies like rubber and gas, which obviously would be used for things like weaponry, planes, ships. And overall, the silver lining to this was that the extensive amounts of military orders completely ended the Great Depression. So because people were working and making so much, product and resources to supply the Allied forces abroad, it really sort of helps restart the economy and in some ways ends the Great Depression. Obviously, people are still going to be struggling to some extent, but it mostly does restart the economy and get things back to normal again. You should also know about the Office of Price Administration, also known as the OPA. This was created in 1942, and it brought down the inflated prices of consumer goods that had been caused by product scarcity. It also encouraged rationing of certain foods like meat and butter. Next up, you have the National War Labor Board, or the NWLB. This was created by FDR to mediate disputes between labor and management, so hopefully it would prevent work stoppages that could have undermined the war effort. It also set a maximum for increasing wages. So obviously FDR is basically saying to labor, look, we can't afford to mess this up. If we are not united as a country, obviously, you do deserve certain rights and certain improvements in your condition, but now is not the time, and you need to band together with the rest of the country to sort of help us advance in the war and provide resources. And obviously, because of this, labor unions were upset by the new wage increase restrictions, so the government passes the Smith-Connolly Anti-Strike Act in 1943. This criminalized strikes against government-controlled companies and allowed the government to seize and operate plants that were threatened by labor disputes. Aside from labor, you should know about the WATs and WAVES. These were organizations where women were enlisted for non-combatant jobs in the Army, Navy, and Coast Guard. And this is really important because it served as a sort of new extension to their traditional roles as nurses during war, which shows how the government really needs all the help they can get. And some women decide to continue working even after the war has ended, which foreshadowed the eventual shift in values regarding women's roles in society. So this is a huge boost for the feminist movement. It's sort of taking away these social expectations that women are solely expected to be homemakers and really allowing them to explore these different societal roles. Aside from that, you should know about the Bracero program. This was an agreement made with Mexico which brought in Mexican agricultural workers to temporarily replace American farmers who had been drafted for the war, and this eventually became a fixed program in many Western states. But moving on, let's talk about some of the domestic changes that were caused by the war. For example, you see that many people migrate to cities like Detroit, Seattle, and largely settled in California. And because FDR wanted to accelerate the South's economic development, he invested a lot of money from defense contracts towards building industrial factories there. However, since the mechanical cotton picker made cheap labor useless and race relations continued to worsen, many African Americans chose to migrate north or west. So now racism is a national issue. It's not just regionally exclusive to the South. And although obviously there was some racism in the North, it's not like it was completely devoid of racists, it's definitely going to become very prevalent and more of a national issue. This leads to the creation of the Fair Employment Practices Commission, also known as the FEPC, and following FDR's executive order prohibiting racial discrimination in defense-based industries, this commission was created to make sure people complied with this order and gave African Americans hope to achieve what they called the double V, meaning victory over fascism abroad and racism at home. This also increased memberships to the NAACP and led to the creation of the Congress of Racial Equality, known as CORE, in 1942, which advocated for nonviolent direct action and became influential in the civil rights movement following World War II. Aside from that, you should know about code talkers. Code talkers were Native Americans who transmitted messages to other allied countries in their native languages, which were incomprehensible to Germany and Japan. So obviously, the US is very worried about their messages being intercepted. They wanted to make sure their system was very secure, so they employed roughly 25,000 Native Americans to send messages in their native languages. And this really ensured that even if these messages were intercepted by the Axis powers, they wouldn't be interpreted by them. Also, I know we talked about this point a couple slides ago, but this is really important to note because by the end of the war, the US was completely out of the Great Depression and thriving once again, unlike other countries who were suffering, were facing economic chaos, had to sort of rebuild their countries. But the US was actually doing pretty good. You would think that because they were in the Great Depression, they, actually came out of the war worse, but because they had to make so many things, it restarted the economy and they were back to normal once again. However, it wasn't all good things. Obviously the national debt rose immensely, but the disposable income for many American families increased. So although, a lot of bad things happened, there was a lot of discrimination towards Japanese Americans, as we'll talk about even more in depth later. There was also a lot of good that happened because of the war, solely because it just sort of got them out of the Depression. But moving on, let's talk about what happens abroad during the war. For example, you should know that immediately following the attacks on Pearl Harbor, Japan attacked many places, including the American outposts at Guam, Wake, and the Philippines. And in the Philippines, a group of American and Filipino soldiers led by General Douglas MacArthur fought back the Japanese for 5 months, but eventually the Philippines fell to Japan. And this all leads to the Battle of Midway in 1942, which occurs on Midway Island near Honolulu. So Japan had hoped that this island would allow them to launch another attack on Pearl Harbor and maybe even compel the US to negotiate a ceasefire in the Pacific. However, the US manages to block these Japanese advances, marking a major victory for them. So the way I like to remember the Battle of Midway is that Japan is hoping that it will make the US meet it halfway or midway. But really, we know that the US is only concerned about defeating Japan so that it can focus its energy on the larger evil of the Nazis. So the US is really not in the type of mood where they're willing to give concessions to Japan. It's just either we defeat you or you surrender, which is why this battle is super important. And after this victory, the US decides to leapfrog between islands that were controlled by the Japanese, capturing small islands to save their resources for the more heavily fortified ones. So for example, in the Guadalcanal Islands, the US fought to protect American shipping lanes to Australia and did so until the Japanese evacuated in 1943. Meanwhile, many Americans, including FDR, wanted to invade France as a diversion because they feared that the Soviet Union wouldn't be able to fight Germany on its own forever and that they may have to sign a separate peace deal with them like they had in 1918. This would leave the Western Allies to fight Germany alone, And ultimately, this entire diversion of invading France was eventually postponed because the Western Allies didn't have the necessary resources at the time, but obviously we do know that they eventually accomplished this on D-Day. But until then, they realized they don't want to just sit idly by and do nothing, so they swiftly capture French-held Tunisia, and eventually the Allied forces also captured Sicily, which led to Italy surrendering and Mussolini being overthrown. So Germany continues to fight for control of Italy, but it's defeated, leading many of them to become prisoners of war and diverting some of the troops from Soviet and French fronts. And this gave the Soviets obviously more time to take territory from Eastern Europe. And soon after this, FDR, Stalin, and Churchill meet in Iran to discuss a coordinated second attack. So they decided that the Soviet Union and other allied nations would simultaneously attack Germany, with the Soviet Union coming from the east and the Allies coming from the west. And this leads to D-Day on June 6, 1944. And with the troops led by General Eisenhower, the Allied forces invaded the French coast city of Normandy because it wasn't as heavily fortified compared to other cities. So obviously we know that Germany is very strong, but they lacked troops in that specific area of France. And the Allies were able to exploit that vulnerability, which was the beginning of the end to Hitler's reign. Paris was soon liberated in August of 1944, and eventually this led to major German cities like Aachen to fall soon after. Meanwhile, in the US, you should know about the election of 1944. Republicans nominate Thomas Dewey and his isolationist vice president, John Bricker, while Democrats nominate FDR and his vice president, Harry Truman. FDR again wins by a landslide because the war was going well for the Allies, and people knew that FDR's experience would be vital in maintaining world peace after the war ended. But back to foreign events, in terms of battles, you should know about the Battle of the Bulge. This started when Hitler wanted to take the Belgian port of Antwerp, which was key to supplying the Allies. The Allies were driven back from the border in the Ardennes forest for 10 days, but eventually the German push was stopped by the 101st Airborne Division. Soon after this, the Soviet Union captured Berlin in April of 1945. The same month, FDR died by a brain hemorrhage and Hitler died by suicide. So in May, Germany decided to surrender unconditionally. Meanwhile, the US continued to fight in Japan and eventually captured the island of Okinawa in 1945. However, the US did sustain massive damage from the Japanese kamikaze bombers, and as a whole, Japan was still unwilling to surrender unconditionally. This leads to the Potsdam Conference in 1945, where now President Truman, who was Vice President Truman but is now president since FDR has died, meets with Stalin and other British leaders to issue an ultimatum to Japan: either surrender or be destroyed. And keep in mind that during this time, the US is working on the Manhattan Project to develop the atomic bomb, and the first intended target of it was supposed to be Germany. However, after a successful test and Japan still refusing to surrender, the US dropped the first bomb in Hiroshima in August of 1945, killing 180,000 people. Japan still refused to surrender, so a second bomb was dropped in Nagasaki, killing 80,000 people. And obviously there are hundreds of thousands of more people who have died or have had other illnesses related to radiation exposure or other long-term effects of the bomb being dropped. And finally, later that month, Tokyo surrendered on the condition that their Emperor Hirohito would remain an emperor, and the Allies, of course, agreed to this condition. So World War II officially ended on September 2nd of 1945. And again, this is a very important concept to note, is that compared to other countries, the US had relatively minimal casualties and was virtually untouched. In fact, they did better because of the war. They thrived because of the war and was able to get out of the Great Depression. And yeah, that does it for this chapter. Here are the credits for how I got everything you just saw. Thank you so much for watching. Comment below if you have any questions. Please be sure to like, subscribe, all of that. You know the drill. It really helps me out and lets me know that these videos are helpful for you so that I can make more videos in the future. So yeah, see you in the next video.